In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at police activities and operations, the development, and some ways that we've changed them over the last few decades. One of the things that dictates what types of innovations a police force has is their size. Size is a very heavy influencer on the operations in general of a police force, particularly with what types of operations they're going to be involved in smaller departments, most all of the officers are going to be what's known as generalists. They're not going to be specialized in investigating any particular type of crime, and instead are just going to focus on whatever crime comes down the pipeline next for them to investigate. In departments of larger size, you will have specialists, homicide police, police that investigate armed robbery, carjacking, drugs, prostitution, juvenile delinquency. Anything that department needs to have happen and have a specialized investigator for, those departments will develop those programs. We've talked before about patrol. It's often called the backbone of policing. There's some truth to that, but there's also some falsehoods to that. So some of the main things that patrol does is it gives the officers a very visible presence in the community, lets the community members see who those officers are, and lets them know that their neighborhood is being patrolled by the police. Additionally, it lets officers know and identify problem areas where they might need to have preemptive patrol. It could be for crime-related issues. It could just be for traffic flow issues. If you've ever tried to drive through downtown Buckhead at lunchtime, the traffic can be very difficult, and so police have to do traffic control there. It's the same thing around areas with lots of churches when those establishments let out their services all at the same time. So really just sort of finding where the needs are is what patrol does, sort of letting the police figure out the needs of the environment. And also, like I said, it lets the police be a part of the community and to see who are the community members, who are the typical people in this area, who might be someone they need to look out for that might be a potential problem, an outsider or a stranger in the area. So patrol has a variety of functions, some of which are actual things that it does, and some of the things are just perceptions from the community, but as we've talked about before, perceptions and the feeling of being safe can be a very important aspect in being a contributing community member, and thus being a community member that can contribute things like information to the police. So a department really has to decide how it wants to operate, and again, a lot of that is based on the resources that they have, exactly what type of proactive strategies they can engage in, also based on their knowledge of what types of services that their community needs, what they're expected to need. If there's a large event taking place, Atlanta frequently has Super Bowls, Final Fours. There was supposed to be a free Taylor Swift concert at the Final Four this year. Thanks Rona. So when you have those big events, you have to prepare for them to avoid negative events from taking place. Again, as we saw in Atlanta in the '96 Olympics, where there was a bomb set off in Centennial Park, and not only is that a loss of life, terrorist action, but it also makes the city look bad, which then makes the city have less funding, and it sort of cascades and has a continued negative effect on the police. For the vast majority of policing, however, is reactive. Either the police see something happen, or they know something is going to happen from information that's given to them, or they have a report that's filed from a community member. But the vast majority of policing is reactive. Police do proactive strategies where they are able, where they have good information, and also where they have the resources to engage in those activities. So why do we patrol? And again, we talked about some of those issues just very recently in this lecture, and also in previous chapters. We talked about the Kansas City experiment before, where we found out that patrol really doesn't matter in terms of reducing actual levels of crime. It does uh, change people's perceptions about an area. It lets them know that the police care about that area and that they should in turn care about the area. And while it doesn't reduce crime overall, people don't typically commit crime while the police are there. So it can sort of change some of the crime patterns. Excuse me. So knowing that there's not a really direct effect of reducing crime with more patrol, then we have to decide where we're going to patrol, how we're going to patrol. Are we going to put cars on the streets? Is it going to be 2 people per car in high crime areas? Are we going to let officers go 1 per car in an area where there's not potentially as much danger for an officer riding solo? That's also based on resources. You know, it's number 1 is based on the safety of the officers, but number 2, and still heavily influential in that decision, does the department have the resources to put 2 officers in each car? We also have to decide where we're going to patrol. Are we going to patrol in high crime areas where we might do the most good in seeing crime taking place or improving the attitudes of the people that live there? Or are we going to be patrolling areas that are fairly low crime, but the people there worry about crime maybe disproportionately than they should compared to their likelihood of being the victim of a crime? In Atlanta, I often call it the Buckhead versus Bankhead fallacy. We should probably have more patrol where there's the higher crime area, but at the same time, the community reaction and the media coverage of the community reaction is very strong when you have something like a shooting taking place at Lenox Mall versus a shooting taking place in it's not in Bankhead, but like at Greenbrier Mall, in an area of lower socioeconomic status in general for that surrounding areas. So it's difficult for police managers to decide where they're going to do put those resources, those limited resources that they have. But it's something that they have to operationally deal with on a daily basis. Additionally, they have to worry about when to change that. What sort of breaking point are we going to allow? How much crime are we going to allow to take place in one area before we increase patrol there? How high profile are the events going to have to be? In Atlanta, for instance, a few years ago, there were organized thieves breaking into boutique stores and stealing expensive blue jeans to sell. You know, at some point, the store owners and the police and the media coverage reached a critical mass, and the police started to do a lot more targeted enforcement on those behaviors. That brings us to the next section, looking at focused interventions, trying to target crime that we know or that we think is going to be taking place. The first type is directed patrol. Again, knowing where what areas can benefit the most from that. Sometimes those are based on hotspots, known areas that are known to be high crime areas. It could be particular areas of the community. If you have car thieves targeting high-end cars, then you go where the high-end cars are. You just sort of have to follow the crime and follow the statistics and the patterns, which is what makes efforts like CompStat, or COBRA as we call it in Atlanta, that much more important, to be able to use those limited resources in the most effective and efficient way possible. You also, another strategy is proactive arrests. Typically, a lot of crime is committed, a large proportion of crime is committed by a very small proportion of the population. And those individuals typically engage in, I think the technical term is dumb shit behavior a lot of the time, which can result in criminal activities, criminal charges, and warrants. So at any given time, a lot of potential criminals, problem criminals, committing high proportions of the crime could be arrested based on outstanding warrants and things like that. It's just whether or not the police have the resources to triage everything coming onto their plate on a daily basis and go back and look at past offenders. But that is something that is done to try to um, make, when possible, to try to make large impacts on the criminal population in a particular area. It can also be focused on specific types of offenses, guns, gun-related offenses, illegal gun sales, or just violence in general. So, for instance, sometimes police departments will even make this information relatively known to the criminals. Not that they're condoning drug use and drug sales, but they're deprioritizing it and saying that if there's no violence, then we're not going to look at this as hard. But if there is violence, then we're going to come down like the right hand of God. So it just depends on what the department's trying to do, what their focus is. Another type of sort of cracking down has been zero tolerance policing, and that is very ineffective, primarily because it's not implemented across all socioeconomic statuses, socioeconomic areas, census tracts, things like that. So what happened in New York when they implemented zero tolerance policing, or as is often known up there as broken windows policing, which is again not the same thing as broken windows theory. Zero tolerance policing was implemented in poorer, higher, non-white areas. So the people that were being having zero tolerance enforced upon them for jaywalking, drinking on the street, peeing in an alley, things like that are illegal, but those weren't being enforced in higher socioeconomic status areas. Instead, they were being focused on poorer communities, communities made up of more non-white community members, and there was a lot of focus saying that crime was down, changing the property values in places like Manhattan. Look at Times Square in the 1980s. It was all porno shops and sex theaters, and now it's some of the most expensive real estate in the country. So there's, in a lot of police operations, you have to sort of look at how they're being implemented, why they're being implemented, and who is having typically some sort of restrictions placed upon them. Another aspect of police operations that's come up recently is issues with police pursuits. My grandmother was a deputy sheriff in Gwinnett County for 30 years, and her saying that she had was that you cannot run the radio. So the first thing is that these are very dangerous endeavors for police to engage in. They oftentimes result in loss of life for the officers, for the suspects, or for civilian bystanders. So it's very important to appreciate that danger in these circumstances. Number one, if you can identify the perpetrator, it's best to just try to catch them at a different time. There's no reason, there's no benefit of causing thousands of dollars of damage, potentially millions of dollars of damage, or causing loss of life if you can identify the person and arrest them at another time. The main issue is if that's not possible, if you can't tell who the individual is or it's not a known offender, that's when the police are probably going to be more likely to try to in the chase because there's more unknowns. Also, if there's imminent danger, that sort of cuts both ways. Is there imminent danger because the chase is happening, or is the person in imminent danger? For instance, if there's a drunk driver running from the police with a child in the car, the continued driving of the individual is posing a danger to the child in the car. If a drunk driver is driving through a area with a lot of pedestrian traffic, continuing the police chase there might be very dangerous as well. So it's something that has to be decided with each individual case. They have standard operating procedures, but each case has to be looked at individually. One advancement in this field, hopefully that will be more present in the coming years, 10, 20, 30 years, is the remote access to vehicles. So the thing that lets OnStar or lets your app start your car for you, the police can simply just turn the car off. If someone has stolen a high-end car or a car that has that technology, then whatever service is providing the remote connection can simply just turn all the electronics of the car and the car won't work. So hopefully that's something that we're moving towards that's going to make it more difficult um, for car thieves to operate and make it safer to end pursuits before they really even begin. So some of the basics of investigations and how we sort of implement those the individuals that go into those specific the specialists as opposed to the generalist, what they're looking to do. There's basically two types of investigations. Your preliminary investigation, where the police arrive on a scene and just try to identify, did something happen? Is something criminal taking place here? Do we have a Karen called the police situation here and nothing further needs to be done? So did something happen? And if something happened, their job is there to protect the scene, and then call in more specialized investigators to handle whatever needs to be done based on the specifics of what did in fact happen. So the follow-up investigation, again, done by those typically specialized investigators. Has a crime been committed? Again, a little more specific determination of what's going on relative to the just initial did something happen, and then trying to identify who did it. Is the person known? The witnesses, or through other obvious evidence located at the crime scene, and then to go get them, to bring that person to answer for the crime that has been committed and what has been done. And then once they have the individual, their job is then to collect and contextualize the evidence that they find, and present their findings to the court system, the prosecutor's office. They're not working directly with the prosecutor's office to try to find a particular individual. The prosecution has its own investigators if they want to investigate specific aspects of a trial. And this is an issue where there might need to be a little bit more separation between the prosecutors and the police in these areas. One thing that's helped this process along is the modern advancements in fingerprinting, but also in DNA. So fingerprints, you typically don't get fingerprints at most crime scenes. You're maybe going to get them at between 15 and 30% of crime scenes. Just the nature of the oil residue leaving and then finding a usable print that has a high percentage match is very difficult. DNA, on the other hand, is more concrete, and it's becoming more of a tool used by police, because everyone that is arrested for a felony in the United States has their DNA taken and put into a sample of potential DNA matches for crimes. So when people are arrested, that their DNA is run through that database. Potentially, even when they're leaving prison, they might run the DNA through the database one more times to make sure they're not letting someone out that they already have that potentially committed a past crime. So there's a lot of information being collected on particular individuals that either the police identify as criminal or that they self-identify as criminal through their behaviors. Okay, so again, that's just sort of a kind of a brief overview of the police field operations, investigations. Make sure to contextualize what we've talked about here with the information listed in the chapters.